Hey everyone, and welcome to part 4 in this 5-part series on how to get better at Scrabble without memorizing tons of words. In this video, we'll be building on some of the concepts we went over in parts 1 through 3 to talk about more in-depth strategy and decision making. Now, the first tip in this section is going to be try to bingo more. Now, it's worth noting that top tournament players tend to bingo nearly 3 times per game on average. And this sounds like a lot, and it is a lot if you don't study a lot of words, but even without memorizing bingos, there are several things you can do to increase the amount you bingo. And as we discussed in the first part, bingos get you a 50-point bonus, so they're a really important way to build up your score. And one way I see a lot of higher rated players, more experienced players, finding bingos that I think a lot of newer players overlook is making sure that you consider looking for 8-letter words through tiles already on the board. I see a lot of less experienced players fixating only on the 7 tiles on their rack and trying to find a 7-letter word with those tiles. But very often, there won't be a 7-letter word in your rack, but there will be an 8-letter word through one of the tiles on the board. So it's important to consider playing through tiles in addition to just bingoing with the tiles on your rack. It also helps a lot to keep in mind the concept of leave, which we discussed in the last video. Trying for bingo-prone leaves, in particular the 10 letters I've listed over here on this slide and I also mentioned in the last video, will really help you bingo a lot more than someone who doesn't understand the concept of leaves as well and tends to keep letters like F's, W's, and V's on their rack that are much more difficult to bingo with. And last but certainly not least, it really helps to separate out common prefixes and suffixes on your rack. So some of the common prefixes include re, on, and out, and some of the common suffixes include er, est, and ing. I've listed some other ones down at the bottom of this slide as well. But as we'll see in the next example, separating those out from the remaining tiles on your rack can really reduce the number of remaining tiles you have to anagram and make it much easier for you to find a bingo. So let's take a look at this rack. Your opponent has opened with fetch, and you have tiles that maybe don't appear to be great at first. You've got an M and a V and a G, but let's think about what we went over on the last slide, and in particular if we have any common suffixes or prefixes. In this case, I'm going to notice that I have an I, an N, and a G on my rack, so I'm first going to separate those 3 tiles out from the rest of my rack. Now, I also see that with my R as well as the E already on the board, so again, I'm keeping in mind that tiles on the board might help me, and in this case, I'm a little short on vowels, right? I only have 2 vowels out of 7 tiles, and an E would go really nice with my rack as another vowel. So if I notice the E on the board and I separate out the R and the E, now it's pretty easy for me to see that with my 3 remaining tiles, I can slide them in the middle of my prefix and my suffix to make the bingo of removing. Now, the next tip is sort of related to bingoing, and it has to do with the concept in Scrabble called fishing. Now, what is fishing? It's when you're really close to a bingo and you play off typically 1 or 2 tiles for a small amount of points with the goal of trying to draw the tile or tiles you need from the bag so you can bingo next turn. So it's sort of sacrificing points on your given turn to try to score a lot of points, namely by bingoing on your next turn. And fishing is very much a double-edged sword. It's great in that it helps you maximize bingoing and hopefully bingo more times in the game, but at the same time, given you're sacrificing a lot of points on the turn at hand, you do need to make sure you're not fishing for something that's so improbable that it doesn't justify the point sacrifice you're making. So in other words, you really need to make sure that the odds that you, quote, catch your fish are high enough to justify the low score of the play you're making on this turn. And in particular, as we'll see in one of the upcoming examples, I see a lot of new players do this, is they play off a single tile on their rack, hoping for a very specific tile out of the bag. So they'll maybe play off 1 tile hoping to draw one of the 2 Fs remaining in the bag. And they specifically are hoping for one of those Fs for their bingo. Now, if you think about it, there's only 2 Fs in the bag of 100 tiles, so you're maybe only 2% or something like that to draw one of the Fs. And as we'll see, playing like this is definitely not a good way to win. You're sacrificing way too many points in order to try to hit something that, yes, it would score a lot of points, but you're so unlikely to hit it, it's just not worth it. So let's take a look at this example first. Your opponent has opened with XU, and you've got this rack here, which looks fairly promising, right? You've got a lot of good bingo tiles, the A, the E, the I, the N, the R, and the T. But unfortunately, there are no playable bingos on this rack. And you'll see that the second A is making life a little bit harder for us. So one thought you might have would be to play off one of the two A's, and then you have a great lead, right? You have no duplicates, and you have A, E, I, N, R, T, all of which are great bingo tiles. So that might lead you to the conclusion that Axe for 10 points here, just playing off one of the A's, is a good play. So this would be a classic example of fishing. Another option would be to play off Retain for 20 points, so you're scoring 10 more points than Axe, but you're only keeping an A. So in this case, which play is correct? Here, fishing is the right way to go, and you can sort of see this by looking at the valuation tab on the left. You'll see that the computer ranks the valuation of Axe about 18 points higher than Retain. So this is telling you just how strong AEINRT is as a bingo leave. And while Retain isn't a terrible play by any means, in this case, it's just not the way to go here because you're giving up way too much firepower you have in terms of bingo potential for only 10 points. Now, you might be wondering, 10 points is still a decent amount to sacrifice, and am I really that likely to bingo after playing Axe? So on the next slide, let's take a look more in depth at some of the math. It turns out that leaving that leave of AEINRT on your rack makes sevens with a tremendous number of different tiles you might draw from the bag. And I've listed them all out over here. A lot of them are obscure words, but there's some of them that are quite common. For instance, you can draw certain with a C, trained with a D, fainter with an F, granite with a G, and reliant with an L. I won't go through the rest of the list, but there's a couple more that make common words and a number more that make words that are a little bit more obscure or difficult to find. And of course, there's many 8-letter words you'll draw through tiles on the board with other possible tiles you could draw from the bag. And if you do have comprehensive word knowledge, it turns out that your odds of bingoing next turn are actually about 80% after Axe. So that's quite high, but only about 20% after Retain since you're just keeping an A. So the A is a decent tile for bingoing, but there's just so much variance since you're drawing 6 new tiles out of the bag. You could get anything from a great bingo rack to drawing 6 more vowels and having a horrible rack. So it's much, much less likely you're going to bingo after playing Retain than you are after Axe, which makes perfect sense, but the numbers here are quite telling because if you analyze the expected cost in terms of the sacrificed bingo percentage, you're actually losing 30 points just in terms of the value of the bingo bonus, because you're giving up 60% chance at bingoing, 80% for Axe versus 20% after Retain, and the bingo bonus is 50 points, so the expected value is that you're giving up 60% of 50, which is 30 points. And if we go back to the previous position, you'll recall that Retain only scored 10 more points than Axe. Retain scored 20 points, whereas Axe scored 10 points. So for scoring 10 more points immediately, you're giving up an expected 30 points in terms of bingo bonus on your next turn. So you're taking 10 points now, but giving up 30 on average on your next turn. So it's actually ultimately going to cost you 20 points on average in the long run. So in this case, playing Retain is actually about a 20-point mistake by these calculations. And if we go back to the previous slide, we'll see that the computer valuation had it as about an 18-point mistake right here. If we recall, the valuation was 37.5 for Axe and 19.4 for Retain. So the computer had it about an 18-point mistake. And using this back of the envelope math here, we have about a 20-point mistake. So pretty close, but either way, we do see that playing Axe is significantly better. Now let's look at a different position here. Your opponent has opened with the word bumph, and you have this rack here. And you've noticed that you're very close to a bingo of blitzing from the B. The only problem is you have an O instead of an N. And you notice that blitzing would score quite a lot of points because you'd place the Z on a double letter and the G would cover the triple word. So you're going to end up getting 6 times the value of the Z along with the 50-point bingo bonus and the triple the letter value for the rest of the word. So blitzing would actually score 140 points, which is a tremendous amount for any play. And that leads to the natural instinct of maybe I should just play off the O and try to draw one of the remaining N's. So maybe a play like Ho from the H. Another option would be to avoid fishing and just take the immediate 35 points with a play of ZD, making overlaps of BI, UT, and MI here. Now, in this case, unlike the previous example, you're much better off just taking the points for ZD rather than fishing. And why is that? Why should you not fish even though you have the potential of scoring so many points? Well, it goes back to a point I made on an earlier slide that the points you give up now for fishing have to be commensurate with the probability of you hitting your fish, of you drawing the bingo you're trying to hit by fishing. And in this case, as we'll see in more detail on the next slide, the odds of drawing one of the remaining N's for blitzing are just not enough to justify the 30 points you're giving up right now. So here you should play ZD, but let's take a look why. So again, the natural retort here would be, blitzing is 140 points if I draw it, and that's so much. And that is of course true. 140 is a tremendous number of points for one play. But if we take a look at the math, we have to consider what the benefit of getting blitzing next turn is compared to an average turn. Right, since if I play ZD now, it's not like I'm going to score 0 next turn. I'm not going to draw blitzing, but I'll still get some points. And turns are typically about 30 points on average. With a random rack, it's a useful metric to keep in mind. So that means that the benefit of hitting blitzing over my expected point value for a random turn is about 110 points. And my odds of drawing blitzing are 8 and 88, and I get that by noting that if we go back to the previous slide, there's 6 N's left that I could draw, and there's also 2 blanks, and the blanks would be just as good as the N's, right, since I could make them any tile I want. So I see 6 N's plus 2 blanks, which is 8 tiles out of 88 total unseen tiles, which means the odds of me drawing either an N or a blank after picking a single tile from the bag are going to be 8 and 88. And that comes out to 9%. So this means that on average, my expected gain from the possibility of drawing blitzing would be 110 points times 9%. So that's an expected gain of 10 points. But again, I have to keep in mind that I'm scoring 30 less points immediately on this turn by playing Ho and fishing versus taking the points with ZD. So Ho is actually almost a 20-point mistake here. Again, because giving up 30 immediately for only an expected benefit of 10 points in the future. And if we go back to the previous slide, the computer valuation shows it as 19 worse than ZD. So again, our rough calculations here do produce very close to the correct valuation estimate. And another factor that none of these calculations even take into account is that your opponent sometimes is going to block blitzing after his or her next play. So again, if we go back to the previous slide, if I play Ho, even if I draw the N or the blank, my opponent very well might make a word here. They might make a word through the U or the B and inadvertently block blitzing, and then my fish, even if I hit it, was all for nothing. So just another factor to keep in mind when fishing is that whatever you hit might not even stay open. And in this case, because of that, in addition to all of the math we've discussed in terms of the probabilities and expected values, fishing is definitely not worth it. So segueing off from fishing now, let's talk about Now, segueing away from fishing into our next topic, let's talk about how you can play cautiously but not terrified. And the reason I added this tip is because I see a lot, especially among newer players, sacrificing a tremendous amount of points to either not open a bonus square, especially a triple word score for your opponent, or to close one of them down if they're open. And in some cases, sacrificing points, or really sacrificing valuation, either points or leave, to avoid opening bonus squares or to shut big bonus squares down is justifiable, but you have to keep in mind that just like with fishing, the sacrifice always has to be proportional. So in this case, the points or leave value you're sacrificing has to be proportional to the danger that you're addressing. And you shouldn't always assume that you have to block a triple word score that's open, for instance. That's something I see time and time again, is there's an open letter in the middle of a triple word score lane, and the player will pass up a 50-point play and make a play for 8 points just to block that. And that's really not something that you should be doing. Sure, you might get burned once in a while, but if you look at the odds as a whole, it's just not going to justify making those kind of point expenditures to block the spot. In general, as some rules of thumb, you should always sacrifice more points to block. So these are more dangerous. As we've discussed before, vowels that are directly adjacent to bonus scores, especially triple word or triple letter scores. And also bingo-friendly tiles, so some of those better tiles we've talked about earlier for bingoing, the A's, the E's, the R's, the S's, the T's, etc., that are between two triple word scores, because that increases the possibility of your opponent hitting a bingo across both triple word scores for a huge number of points on a triple-triple. And things that are less important to block, so you shouldn't be as paranoid about blocking these, you shouldn't sacrifice so many points to block really ever, are double word and double letter scores, just because the damage your opponent can cause with these bonus squares is a lot more limited than the triple word and triple letter scores. And also bingo tiles between two triple word scores that are more difficult to hit. So your F's, your V's, your W's, they're a lot less scary because they're much harder to bingo through than an A, an E, or a T. So let's take a look at this position here. It's about a tie game early on, and you have found a bingo of Elevate on your rack. And there are two places you can play it on this board. One of them is over here, making the two-letter word EW, and this scores 79. And your other option is to play it under Swift, making the two-letter word TE, which scores 77. So in this case, a lot of people might immediately just play the Elevate next to Walruses, thinking it's 2 more points, but here that's not correct. In this case, it is worth sacrificing the 2 points because there's a significant amount of risk associated with this placement of Elevate. There's actually a number of spots here you've opened that are very dangerous if your opponent has the right tiles. One of them, of course, is the top row here. Your opponent could potentially hit a triple-triple bingo through this E, and that E is in a dangerous spot. If you think about the E in the second spot of an A-letter word, you could have words starting with RE, one of the common prefixes we discussed on an earlier slide, along with many other words. So that's a particularly dangerous opening to be making. Another opening is for overlap plays over here, where I've just drawn the arrow. You could very well put a 4-point tile, say, in the corner here and get that tile multiplied 6 times by hitting both a horizontal word to this E as well as a vertical word down on the first column. So that's another spot your opponent could easily use for 40 or maybe even 50 points. And thirdly, there's a big opening you've created over here, where I've just drawn the arrow, for 3-letter words that hook EW, and then possibly a bingo or other high-scoring play downwards, which will take advantage of the triple word score over on the middle row in the left-hand column of the board. So there's a lot of risk associated with this placement of Elevate, whereas the second placement really doesn't have that much risk. You are opening a triple word score from this L, but if you think about it, the worst thing that could happen really is a 3-letter word from the L, right? There's no potential for a bingo through this L. There's no potential for a big overlap play like we saw before. Really, the worst thing that could happen is maybe your opponent hits a 3-letter word there and gets 20 or possibly 30 points. It's really not any potential for a catastrophic scenario or even a somewhat large score. So that's really not that big a risk. And there are a couple other openings associated with this placement of Elevate, such as this triple letter score to double word score spot if your opponent has a tile such as a D or an S that hooks Elevate, but this is a lot less dangerous than some of the triple word score openings we looked at before. So in this case, given you're only giving up 2 points, it's definitely worth it to play this placement of Elevate. Now let's take a look at a slightly different example here. So again, the score is pretty close, and you've got two pretty strong options you're considering. One of them is to play the word feet through this F for 21, and the other option is to play the word vertex to this X for 37. Now, vertex, of course, has a higher valuation since it scores 16 more points, and it keeps a nice leave of ET. But a lot of people will think that feet might be the better play because it blocks this F that's sitting between two triple word scores on the first column. And while it's true that disaster scenarios can certainly happen through this F, if your opponent does manage to play an 8-letter word through it, it's very, very unlikely. The situation we saw before with elevate, where you had an E up here on the B1 square, is far more dangerous because it's a lot easier to make an 8-letter word with an E in the second spot than it is with an F in the fifth spot. So the odds of your opponent hitting a triple bingo through the F are extremely small. And if your opponent just makes a, say, 4-tile play from this F, they might score around 30 points, but it's really not at all possible that you'll be hit with a disaster scenario there, with either a bingo doesn't fit, or you can't have any major overlap plays or any other way to get, say, 6 or 9 times the value of a tile. You'll only be tripling the value of a tile, and there's nothing that could fit there that's worse than about a 30 or maybe 40-point play. So in this case, you're actually better off just playing vertex and not giving up 16, which again is a lot of points. The previous example, it was only a 2-point sacrifice. Here you'd be giving up 16 points to play feet, which is quite a lot. And here the danger of the F is really just not that large. So it's not worth it to give up the 16 points and play feet to block the F. You're much better off just taking the points with vertex, keeping a strong leave, and leaving the F open. So this is sort of a nice segue into the next tip, which is actually very closely related, and that's taking the score into account. It came up in, I think, the first video that the goal of Scrabble is to score points, but not to score as many points as you can. The goal is to score more points than your opponent. And I mentioned in the first video that this is a subtle difference, but a very important difference, and this is now the point where we see why. The key strategical concepts to keep in mind are that when you're winning, you should always try to close the board down and try to stop your opponent from making big scoring plays or especially bingoing. Because if I'm winning, my goal isn't just to keep scoring and try to score as many points as I possibly can. My goal is to just hold on to my lead and continue to stay ahead of my opponent. And reducing the variance, if we want to use a statistical term, reducing the standard deviation or what have you of your opponent's expected turn score is going to help me achieve that goal. Whereas on the flip side, if I'm losing, I need to take more risks and try to introduce volatility, introduce additional variance to the game in order to give myself a chance to come back. If I'm down 100 or 150 points and I just play passively and then allow my opponent to do what I was saying before and close the board down, I'm going to have no way to come back into the game, and I'm just going to be resigning myself to losing by 100 points. So I might end up getting hammered and losing by even more. That's fine. If I want to have any chance of coming back, I need to take risks and be proactive in those type of situations. So here we have one of the second types of situations where I'm down 170 points. And you'll notice this is actually one of the same exact positions we just looked at in the previous section, only I've edited the score to make it a little bit different in terms of the analysis. So once again, we're looking at the two placements of elevate we discussed before, one of them next to walruses and one of them under swift. And when the score was close in the previous example, we determined that playing elevate in this spot here below swift was a lot safer and therefore worth a 2-point sacrifice. But here, if we think about what we just discussed in the previous slide, I'm actually better off introducing more volatility by playing this elevate. Because if I think about it, I'm scoring 79 points for my bingo, which is going to lead me to a score of 140, and I'm still going to be down almost 100 points after my bingo, which is quite a lot. And because of that, I don't want to be passive. I want to be aggressive, and I need to be willing to undertake the risk that my opponent might hit a big play there, and end up increasing his or her lead even more. That's a risk I have to be willing to accept, because if I don't take a risk, I'm just going to have no way to claw back into this game. So here I should definitely play this elevate. I give myself an opportunity to hit possibly a triple-triple if I get lucky enough, or at the minimum one of these two triple word scores on the first column that I've opened up. So now let's take a look at the other of the two positions we discussed before, except that I've once again modified the score, in this case such that you're now up by over 100 points before the start of your turn. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how does the score now affect our decision between playing feet on the leftmost column and taking out this spot where your opponent might hit one or both triple word scores through the F, and playing vertex to the X, which leaves the F open but scores 16 more points. And on the previous example, when the score was just about even, we decided that vertex was the better play because 16 is a lot of points to give up and the F is just not that dangerous. But in this case, if we think about the fact that we're going to be up 130, 150 points after our next play, the F all of a sudden becomes a lot more dangerous because it gives by far the best avenue for your opponent to claw back into the game quickly. If you look at the board after feet, there really isn't a good way for your opponent to score a lot of points, and there really aren't a ton of great places for your opponent to bingo. So the 16 points is not going to be looming that large in this case because you're already up 135 after you play feet, since your score will be 223 after this play. So another 16 points is just not that big a deal compared to the possibility after vertex that your opponent might hit a 100-point bingo or possibly even more than that if it's a triple-triple through this F. And then your lead could evaporate in as little as one play. So again, this is just one example of the principle that when you're winning in the game, you want to play extra cautiously and take out spots where your opponent could very quickly get back into the game with a bingo or 100-point play. So in this case, you do want to play a bit more paranoid and make the play of feet to take out that spot instead of being aggressive with vertex. And that concludes part 4. I hope you'll join me in the next video for the 5th and final part, where I'll go through some more advanced topics and tournament tips.